Well, thank you, Pete. I'm sure glad to be here. Like Pete said, he and I don't get to see each other very often. We both, I'm retired from Extension. He's still working some for Extension post-retirement, but I'm glad to at least be able to work with you on this, Pete. I appreciate the opportunity. Today, I want to talk to you about some challenges and opportunities that you may not have thought about, especially the challenges part. There's no shortage of challenges managing land in any place. In Texas, no exception. There's plenty of challenges in farming and ranching, but there's a particular challenge that I hope to make the case for, and then some solutions to that as we move through this today. And it has to do with saving family lands. That's the way we like to put it. I represent today Texas Ag Land Trust. Keep in mind we're one of over 30 in Texas, so there's a variety of land trusts you could choose from to work with. And of course, I'm a little bit jumping the gun here because you don't know what I'm talking about yet, but keep that in mind as we go along. You'll see our logo repeatedly because this is one of our presentations, but and we'd like to work with you, but there are plenty of other land trusts that may or may not fit you better. And so we want to make sure people know that. Okay. Excuse me. Our mission, Texas Ag Land Trust, is to conserve Texas heritage of ag lands, natural resources, and wildlife habitats. And simply put, that's we're trying to, excuse me a little bit, our slides are kind of slow and showing up on my screen. I'll adjust to it here in a minute. We try to provide tools just like we're doing today to help private landowners keep their working lands, farms, ranches, forested lands, wildlife dedicated lands, working for generations to come. That's what we try to do in our work. And some particular challenges that I want to bring up to you today that you might not have thought about is that about 400,000 acres of ag land has been lost since between 97 and 2012. That's a period of data collection that we're going to be looking at today. And actually, the size of land lost to non-agricultural development is greater than that, and I'll get to that. Another challenge is that landowners are getting older. The average age now is 57, and making it closer all the time to the point where the next generation will take over. In fact, probably the greatest intergenerational transfer of land is underway now that's ever taken place, at least in the state of Texas, probably nationwide. And it's something to keep in mind and also something to think about as you approach that period of time in your own life that where it becomes important and you start looking for ways to accommodate that. One particular person that we've worked with as a land trust took this to heart. She said, "I'm taking steps to keep the ranch intact. The land is too important for its future to be left to fate." And the tools we're going to be talking about, basically a conservation easement, is what can help with that concern that many people have. The estate tax, estate settlement drives a lot of land selling. In fact, it's the major driver, according to the A&M Real Estate Center, for land selling, the major motive. And that feeds into this intergenerational transfer. Of course, the estate tax becomes an issue at the passing of the owner of the land. Those estate taxes can drive fragmentation, breaking the land up as you sell it to pay those estate taxes. The data that we want to look at today to kind of make the case for this before we get into some of the specific tools, and I think it's important to lay the groundwork, the framework, comes from Texas Land Trends, which is a study done by the A&M Natural Resources Institute. It's done, it's summarized and updated every 5 years. We're in the process right now of getting pretty close to the next release of updated information. What we'll be looking at today is information up to 2012. And they take information that gives a better understanding of the trends in land use. The primary data comes from the county appraisal districts and also the National Ag Statistics Service. And they've looked at relationships between land value, land ownership, and land use on working lands. You'll see farms mentioned repeatedly in some of the slides coming up. That's just short for farms, ranches, family forests, and country that's managed primarily for wildlife. It includes all those working lands. So try to remember that and not think it's really just talking about farms. Texas is changing. Boy, that's no surprise to any of us that have been here a while. I've been here all my life, and I've seen a lot of changes in my time. There's 171 million acres in Texas. About 95% of it is private. Of that 95%, 83% is rural. About 17% is already developed. So that leaves us with 142 million acres of private working lands that we're talking about. And surprisingly, landowners make up less than 1% of the population of the state. And our current population is over 26 million now. In fact, it's gone from 19 million to 26 million, which was the population in 2012. It's certainly more than that now. About a 36% increase over that period of time. That's 500,000 people per year that moved to Texas, or at least our population increased that much. And 65% of the increase occurred within the top 10 populated counties. You can see on the map here the usual suspects: Austin, San Antonio, Dallas, Fort Worth, the Houston area, the Rio Grande Valley, and El Paso. And that population growth is projected to continue. No surprise there. If you look at this graph here from the state demographer, if no more migration happened, we'd still increase to over 32 or 33 million by 2050. If we follow the same, just half the amount of migration that's going on now, we'll be well over 40 million by 2050. And if the trend continues as it is uninterrupted, we'll be way up there with 55 million. In other words, having doubled our population in a period of about 40 years. Now, some of this may seem like kind of dark clouds to be presenting to you today, and I don't want it to be that way. It's just reality, and it's some things we need to think about as we farm and ranch and manage land. What does the future hold for the availability of that land with so many people moving in? Why is Texas growing? Well, we lead the country in job growth. People are attracted here for that reason. More and more people are urban in their place of residency. Rural population has dropped off considerably in the last 65 years, as depicted on this graph, and that trend continues. I mentioned we have about 142 million acres left. It started off in 97 with 143 million acres. So over that period of time, we lost about 1 million acres of working lands. And you can see on the graph here the trend over that period of time, steadily downward. It has kind of leveled off the last little while, but I have a feeling the information coming for the period between 2012 and 2017 is going to continue that trend and even make the case even stronger that we need to have some solutions. Market value of land prices statewide have tripled, more than tripled over the period of time from 97 to 12, and a gain of about $1,000 per acre. The takeaway message is that the land price has tripled, whatever the value was, and you see a lot of that land value change in the major metropolitan areas. Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio corridor, and around Houston. But a considerable amount of land increase in price across the large part of the state. And that land price is a big driver of whether or not the land gets sold and split up into smaller pieces. We see from the land trends data that there's kind of an inflection point at 140 acres. Below that point, land on the average is hard to make a living on. At least you're not in the red. I mean, you're not in the black. You're not a profitable entity. So once you get to that point, it gets more and more tempting to break it up into even smaller pieces in order to make some money off that land. It seems to be a driver for the sale of land. And we know that ownership size, measured by acres, of course, is shrinking. And we call that fragmentation, land being broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. There's been an increase of about 500,000 acres of farms that are less than 100 acres. Again, that's farms, ranches, and forested country and so forth. A decrease of about 4 million acres of the 100 to 2,000 acre pieces of property. And interestingly, there's been some consolidation, much less consolidation than there has been fragmentation, but those properties greater than 2,000 acres, we've seen about a 400,000 acre change in properties that size. So in some parts of the state, Trans-Pecos is one, for example, there's been some consolidation, which is good news. But we're seeing a rapid change in open space. We never used to think a whole lot about the term open space. Maybe it wasn't even around. But I think as houses get closer and closer together, as the state becomes more and more populated, the ability to see a long ways, the ability to see open space becomes more and more valuable. And we're seeing a drastic increase in that open space, especially as depicted here. Land use conversion has followed those same trends. In other words, land being converted in its use from agricultural production to non-agricultural production. And in most cases, it's a permanent conversion. It likely will never come back into production or availability for agricultural uses. And keep in mind, please, as I say agricultural, I'm also talking about wildlife habitat and so forth, products of the rangeland, just as livestock might be. So there's really an urgency about this. For every 1,000 people who move to Texas, about 200 acres of rural working lands are lost. And it's not a good thing to have a gold star for, but Texas is losing rural land at a faster rate than any other state. And of course, that loss impacts food and fiber production, water resources, and basically quality of life. You could call it an existential threat. Legitimately, because the existence of open space is being threatened. The existence of ag working lands is being threatened and being whittled away at little by little. In some cases, a lot by a lot. The state tax has a big hand in that. People having to sell land because of having to pay the state taxes when the person that owned it passed away, a family member. Development and conversion is causing fragmentation, which makes those parcels smaller and smaller, and as I said earlier, less and less likely to be profitable, which drives that movement to smaller and smaller, because you may be tempted to sell your smaller place to even smaller places, just so you can make some money off of it. So what is a land trust? It's about time I got to that, right? It's part and parcel to one of the solutions for this, at least something that can mitigate the loss of these working lands. It's like Texas Agricultural Land Trust and these other land trusts that are in Texas. It's a private nonprofit entity whose mission is land conservation. It's known as a conservation easement holder. They hold those conservation easements that I mentioned earlier. They have a right to, by virtue of that conservation easement, to monitor it and come visit once a year just to make sure that the conservation values that are in that easement are continuing to be upheld. And the goal in our case, and in the case of many land trusts, if not most, is to keep working lands working, whether they're working for the sake of livestock or crop production or wildlife production or recreation, to keep them available for those activities and not be threatened in the future by breakup and being sold off and converted to other uses, or sold off in smaller pieces. So I mentioned a land trust first because it's the entity that handles a conservation easement. Now we'll get to what is a conservation easement. It's very important to remember that it's voluntary, first of all, and it's negotiated to fit you as a landowner, your desires, and it's a legal agreement between the landowner and the land trust that limits development, the very thing we're trying to do, and other non-ag uses, but otherwise encourages ag production. At least that's specifically the kind of conservation easement that an ag land trust would deal with. And you could think of it as sort of the legal glue that ties the property owner's good intentions to their land permanently. And that's exactly what some people would like to do. So to carry on with what a conservation easement is, to be a little more specific, if you think of your rights as a bundle of rights, you would selectively remove some of those sticks from the bundle from the title of the land, ones that maybe rights that you weren't going to use anyway. In fact, you want to make sure the right to break the place up into tiny pieces in the future would be something you don't want to see happen. So you would remove those rights from the bundle of your rights. And it's individually tailored. I mentioned that it's negotiated, and it's very much individually tailored. Some folks have a preconceived notion about conservation easements based on a particular easement that they've heard about, and that might be an easement they would never agree to, but on their land they can individually tailor an easement that would fit them should they decide to do so. It's filed at the courthouse. It's a legal agreement provided under state law, and it protects specific conservation values, as I mentioned a while ago, very specific things that will be protected. It's generally perpetual in nature, and it runs with the land. It's binding on all future owners. That's how it's perpetual. It's part of the deed. It goes wherever the deed goes. So the land could be sold, for example, and we fully expect a conservation easement eventually, land with a conservation easement on it someday to be sold, but it would still stay together. Having another owner is not really a problem. It's to be expected eventually, but the land stays together, and that's the goal under another owner. So what are the purposes of conservation easement? Here are some of those. Protection of significant natural and ecological resources. Protection of historical resources might be something on your place, may or may not be. Public access may be something you want to provide. It may not be, then you don't include it in the easement. Protection of specific values, specific conservation values to be outlined in the easement that would be something that, a suite of things possibly that are on your place that you want to protect. So the purpose of an agricultural conservation easement is to protect the viability and productivity of ag lands while they're also protecting these specific conservation values that are outlined. What about negotiating conservation easement? It's a process, and sometimes it takes 6 months to a year. Just depends on how long it, especially if there's a large family where everybody has to agree to everything. It just takes some time, and we understand that that's just part of the deal. But the process is essentially the same, whether it's a donated easement or a purchased easement. And allow me to mention that first without defining it. I'm going to do that next. But the process is the same for either one of those. First, you determine what those reserved rights are. Which of those sticks are you going to pull out of the bundle that you want to either donate or sell? Next, you get 2 appraisals. Well, after getting your own attorney and making sure you have a good attorney and financial counseling of your own, you can't count on the land trust for that. They wouldn't want to be that for you. With good appraisals, 2 of them, one the value before the conservation easement, in other words, a fair market value for your place, and then an appraisal with someone who knows conservation easements to put a value on the place after it has a conservation easement. And that's a very important step. It may take a little while, and you'd want to find the right people for that, especially for the conservation easement appraisal. Then we develop a baseline report. In my work with Texas Ag Land Trust, I get involved with that quite a bit. That's simply a snapshot of what the land is like right now, and as you're entering into the conservation easement. It's a nice little document to have for the future. It's a basic look with photographs and GIS information and so forth about the place, and that's a requirement for the conservation easement process. The easement is then executed and filed in the real estate records at the county courthouse. Now, some people have different motivations for having a conservation easement. It's part of that negotiation process where you want to tailor it to fit you specifically. Mary Ruth Rodenbaugh with Holly Farms said, "I want my grandchildren to have the opportunity to farm the land and raise cattle just like their ancestors did. I want them to inherit it and develop the same feelings for it that I have. Roots are important." I know Mary Ruth, and she is really passionate about her place and passing it on to her heirs and protecting it. So this was a very good tool for her. Another partner with Texas Ag Land Trust entered into a mitigation banking agreement, which is with another entity, but part of that is that a conservation easement be required so that the land would be permanently protected. And in their case, it was a species mitigation bank for lesser prairie chickens. They say by selling our development rights to the conservation bank, that's that species mitigation bank, we could ensure that the land would never be developed for other purposes, stabilize the habitat, and have money set aside to accomplish our management goals that honor our family's commitment to leave the land better than we found it. Isn't that the goal of a lot of folks? And it's an admirable goal. A conservation easement can help you do that. It was part and parcel of this mitigation banking agreement that they entered into, and we were glad to serve as the holder for that conservation easement. So types of conservation easements. You might think I got the cart before the horse, and maybe I did, but back to the donated versus perpetual easements. A donated easement, and that's the two basic kinds. A donated easement is governed by IRS regulations because it can be considered a charitable contribution, and it has to be perpetual to qualify for that deduction. And a purchased easement, the other kind, you may hear it called a PDR, or a purchase of development rights, is governed by the rules of the organization that funded the purchase. And they may have particular requirements that they would have on a conservation easement if they're going to participate in it. A term easement in that case might be possible. But again, it's pending the funding organization's rules. There's actually the third kind, but it's really just a combination of the two. You may donate part and have a part of it that you're being able to sell. Part of it could be a PDR, and the remaining part you would be donating. Those kinds of deals are not uncommon at all. There are tax incentives. I mentioned the charitable contribution and IRS being involved. There are what we've come to call now enhanced tax incentives that were made permanent by Congress in 2015, thank goodness, because before that, every couple of years, it would be on and off, and it was really hard to predict what the future held for the land conservation business or the concerns. With that tax incentive, you can deduct against 50% of your adjusted gross income, and in fact 100% if more than 50% of your adjusted gross income comes from agriculture. You can carry that forward for 15 years past the year of donation. And here's an example of how this process would work. First, you have to get a valuation of the conservation easement. Let's say your place is worth $4 million. That's the appraised value before the conservation easement. You get a second easement, a second appraisal, again from someone experienced in conservation easement appraisals. And we and other land trusts can give you a list of people you might consider that we know about. After a conservation easement, you have another value. In this case, it would be $2,400,000, and you've reduced the value by 40%, or a total of $1.6 million. That's the amount that's been decreased. That's the value of the charitable contribution if you're going to donate it. So here's an example of how that might work out. Let's assume you have a adjusted gross income of $200,000 and it remains pretty constant. If you were to spread that out over 15 years using 50% of it, which is the maximum unless most of your income comes from agriculture, you could recoup all of that $1.6 million by the deductions. 1.3 million in the years 3 to 15, and then 100,000 each of the 3 years before that. So it's kind of a handy choosing of figures here so that it makes the picture easier. But I hope you get the understanding of it. The difference between the fair market value of the place and the value of the place after placing a conservation easement on it is the amount of the charitable deduction, and you can deduct that against half of your AGI for 16, what amounts to 16 years, to recoup, in some cases, every bit of it, like we did here. How would that work? Well, let's look at not a real world example, but it could be real world. The Jones Ranch and the Smith Ranch, they're same size, worth the same amount, same kind of country. Mr. Jones does not have a conservation easement on it, doesn't have a state plan to speak of. Mr. Smith put a conservation easement on his place, which reduced the value of it to $22 million. And he donated the $11 million and will be getting deductions for it for 16 years. Or if he had found the funds, he could have sold it, but regardless of the easement. But regardless, he's reduced the value of it to $22 million, which puts him below today's tax law combined exception and would not be affected by the state law, the estate tax law. Mr. Jones or Ms. Jones, whichever one it is, did not have that kind of planning. When he or she passed away, to pay estate taxes, they had to sell about a third of the place. And then there were 4 heirs, so it was divvied up 4 ways between the heirs. To get it sold, he put it in 2 pieces, and the 4 heirs, you can see in one fell swoop, they've divided the place 6 different ways. This happens over and over, and it's a sad thing to see. Some of those that are here with us today probably have stories they can tell about someone they know, or maybe personal experience where this has sadly happened. The family place gets broken up in pieces and what starts it is paying the federal estate tax, and no plan to keep it from being broken up into pieces among the heirs, rather than staying in one piece. So this is, I think, a good example of how land can be kept together and kept permanently in availability for agricultural production. And keep in mind, I said availability for ag production. It doesn't mean you have to have cows on it, you have to have a wildlife operation, or you have to do anything in particular. The land stays available for agricultural production, in our mind at least, or available for whatever the particular land trust philosophy that you might deal with would think would be important. There are some limited options for purchasing of development rights, and I wish they weren't so limited, because they actually have become a little more abundant lately. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But there's some federal funds available through the Ag Conservation Easement Program with the Natural Resources and Conservation Service. With them also is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. There are some state funds. I'll tell you about each of these in the next few slides. There are some state funds through the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program that can provide for purchase of development rights. It's not a whole lot of money for the size of Texas. It's $2 million every 2 years, but it's something. And there are local opportunities, especially in the hill country and near other municipalities, mostly water related, but not entirely. What do you need money for? Well, let me explain that a little better. Well, first of all, for the value of that conservation easement. And with the purchased conservation easement, much like the charitable contribution of a donated conservation easement, it's the difference between those two values, the fair market value appraisal and the appraisal that takes the easement into account. So it's the same kind of comparison. In this instance, it was $1.6 million, you'll recall from my example. Well, the same would be true here. $1.6 million in that same example would be the amount that you would need to find a buyer for. And there are transaction costs. The title check, it takes some doing to put together a conservation easement document. You'll have to have legal assistance there. The land trust will be working with you to negotiate on that, or to negotiate one that the land trust basically can live with too. The mineral report, if that's applicable, it will be part of the funding needs. Mortgage, if applicable, the loan subordination process. That baseline document I mentioned takes some time and money to put together. Recording the easement, and then a stewardship fund is a particular fund that each easement owner, donor or seller puts together and leaves with the land trust to serve as a principal from which the proceeds are used to pay for those annual visits to check on not so much exactly how you're managing the place, but or to pester you about those kinds of things, but to make sure those specific conservation values that are in the conservation easement are still being upheld. And in our case, it's usually a very friendly meeting, and I enjoy it, and I hope the landowners do too. But it's a way to look at what the landowners do and learn from, in my case, learn from them and enjoy seeing their country. But at the same time, keep in mind the conservation easement requirements and whether or not they're still being upheld. And generally, that's not a problem at all. But we like to maintain a real good relationship with the landowners, and that's a good time to visit with them about whatever their needs might be and how we could help them out. Back to the funds that are available on the federal side, the NRCS through the Ag Conservation Easement Program has a deadline this year, the 30th of April, for applications for that program. It's a continual sign up after the 2019 deadline that you'll still be considered for next fiscal year. But some good news has come out of the Farm Bill, and that is that NRCS pays 50 to 75% of the value, and in the past the Farm Bill required that the part that remained, either 50 or 25%, could only be half of that could be donated by the landowner, and that's all. And a non-federal match had to be found for the rest of it. The way the Farm Bill is now, and they're in the rulemaking process right now, we're not sure how it'll all flesh out exactly, but the Farm Bill has removed that requirement for a local match. In other words, it looks like that other half of the value of the easement, or 25%, whichever way it ends up being, could be donated by the landowner. And that's going to really be make these funds a lot more accessible by most people. Because as I mentioned, in some cases, the only local match money that you might be able to come up with, if you're not close to a municipal area where there's some other programs going on, would be that Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program. And that $2 million every 2 years doesn't go very far for a state as big as Texas. We're glad it's there, but it wasn't enough to get the ball rolling very much with using these ag land easement funds from NRCS. So we look forward to that providing a whole lot more utility for those funds and availability for those funds now that the new Farm Bill is out. They also have the Wetland Reserve easements. Deadline for application for them is the 30th of April of this year, and they cover 100% of the easement value and 75 to 100% of the restoration costs. But be sure and check with your local USDA service center to get the fine details on all these. I'm just kind of getting the ball rolling here and thinking you might want to follow up and get more information on those. Again, within NRCS, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, it partners with entities like land trusts to lever other sources of funding, and they'll have up to 8 different conservation focus areas around as determined by the Secretary of Agriculture. And depending on whether or not you're in one of those focus areas, you have applications for 2019 or something you might want to think about. And as far as I can tell, that deadline hasn't been determined yet, but go to your USDA service center and they'll be able to fill you in on that as well. There are other funds. I mentioned the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program, managed by Parks and Wildlife Department, by an oversight board of representatives from all kinds of statewide ag organizations, people that understand agriculture. And that can help you with that purchase of conservation easements as well. If you're near the coast, you might remember the BP and Transocean incident. I see a typo there, sorry about that. The oil spill caused by the explosion of that exploratory well and all that oil spill that resulted from it. BP has put almost $2.4 billion into a fund, $150 million from Transocean, managed by Fish and Wildlife Foundation and distributed by them to areas that could be restored after having been exposed to that oil spill. RestoreTheTexasCoast.org is where you'd want to go to look at the availability of those funds. And if you're on the coast, again, these are some pretty good opportunities for you. The Restore Act in 2012 provides for a regional approach to restoring the long-term health of ecosystems along the Gulf Coast. $800 million has been available to date. So that to restore and conserve habitat, water quality, replenish living coastal and marine resources, even to enhance community resilience and so forth, restore and revitalize the Gulf economy by doing that. That may be something that can help you out too, also with the conservation easement. Kind of quickly here, I don't want to, I'm about at the end of all these, but again, on the Gulf Coast, there's a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Gulf Coast Conservation Grants Program. And it covers projects that otherwise weren't funded by the oil spill money and it's the Shell Marine and Wildlife Habitat Program that you might want to look at. The next call for proposals hasn't been put out yet. North American Wetlands Conservation Acts, NAWCA, has a small grants program up to $75,000 for those transaction costs I mentioned to you for projects in the U.S. The NAWCA also has a standard grants program up to $1 million per grant, and there's a grant cycle that ended in February and another one ends the 3rd of July. Again, you might want to check that out and see if it would apply to a conservation easement that you're interested in putting in place. Montana has an interesting solution for coming up with money to purchase conservation easements, and it's driven by fishing enthusiasts through Montana Land Reliance, that land trust in Montana has over 1 million acres in land in conservation easements now. And maybe I haven't made this point clear yet, but the land trust doesn't own the land by any stretch. All we do is, well, land trusts can purchase land. I'm just saying it's not a requirement for them to hold the easement and then own the land, any part of the land. They simply hold those development rights. They're the caretaker for those development rights that you've sold or donated. And Montana Land Reliance has had sold or donated over 1 million acres. And it's driven by fishing enthusiasts, people who are concerned about the quality of the stream that they're fishing in as it's affected by land either on the banks of that stream or upstream. And so they'll contribute money to put a conservation easement on a place that they may never be able to fish on, maybe not ever even visit. But they know that conserving that place, putting it in a conservation easement upstream, will have such a positive impact on the stream they fish in that it's worth for them to pitch in and help buy that conservation easement or pay the landowner for that conservation easement. So that's a pretty interesting concept, and it's worked real well in Montana. Those private funds are not really available in Texas. I don't know of any situation, significant situation where that's available. We hope someday that it might be, though, for various resources, wildlife and fisheries related. Local and resource specific funds are available if you're close to a major city like San Antonio. To protect their aquifer, they have an initiative that buys conservation easements on land above the aquifer, recharge zones. The City of Austin is protecting Barton Springs, and they're doing similar things to protect the flow of Barton Springs by having conservation easements on land outside of town in the watershed that serves Barton Springs under conservation easement. The Department of Defense has an interesting program that creates buffers around military installations so that development can't creep right up on their fence line and hinder the maneuvers that they might want to do within the military installation, like Fort Hood, for example. I've mentioned Deepwater Horizon settlement funds, and then mitigation banking. To flesh that out a little more, it's to offset the impact of industry usually elsewhere in similar habitat or similar land type by permanently protecting land somewhere else. So it could involve a wetland that has to be altered because of a refinery going in near Houston, or it can be to protect us. In that case, there would be a wetland mitigation bank somewhere that would be permanently protected with a conservation easement to offset the damage that had to be done to that wetland elsewhere. The species mitigation bank would involve protecting habitat for a particular species, so that if an entity had to do unavoidably had to do some damage to habitat for that species somewhere else within that same area, type habitat, they would have a mitigation bank from which they would buy credits to allow them to do that damage, so to speak, in habitat elsewhere. Therefore, there's a protected area to offset what they had to do with their development, permanently protected, and again with the conservation easement in place to facilitate that. There are pros and cons of a conservation easement. Imagine that, and we want to be honest about that. It's not for everybody. There are some benefits. We've one by one pointed these out to you. It can be considered a charitable contribution that may fit your tax picture, may not. Estate tax relief, it's definitely a good tool to facilitate that, and also to facilitate overall succession planning. It relieves pressure on your heirs in that regard, for that matter. And maybe one of the most important things, and it's the motivation for a lot of people, it binds your good intentions to the land in perpetuity. That's that legal glue I mentioned earlier. You have intentions for the land, and you want to see that carried after your passing, carried on after your passing, and so you have this ability to do that permanently. It protects ag production values. It protects conservation values, as we mentioned, and the end result, it limits the possibility of future fragmentation and non-ag development. But it's not for everyone. The high transaction costs in some cases might make it less than feasible for some people. The smaller a place gets, that might be more likely, because some of the transaction costs are pretty much fixed regardless of the size of the place. So it's an economy of scale kind of deal in some people's mind. So transaction costs can be considerable. There's limited funding for purchased easements, unfortunately. The sale of a conservation easement is subject to capital gains tax, something to keep in mind. You want to have a good tax advisor to talk to in this process as you consider it. The tax benefits are generally only available to the first generation. Of course, the use of the property is limited for the future. That could be a benefit, or it could be a negative. In the case of people who want to do put in place a conservation easement, that's exactly what they want to do. That's not a negative to them. They want to limit the use of the property in the future, at least for development, non-agricultural development. And of course, the value of the property is reduced by the conservation easement. That's all inherent in the process. So just to summarize, I guess, if you donate an easement, you can get an income tax deduction. If you sell an easement, some have said, well, what's the big deal? It was like a no-brainer decision for me. I got paid to do what I wanted to do anyway. Some people look at it like that. Estate tax relief is a big plus, I'd say, and it's hard to deny that it really facilitates succession planning well and relieves pressure on the heirs. And probably most important to most people, and it sure stands out to me, it can help you facilitate your land stewardship legacy, a conservation easement that's tailored to your desires and allows you to permanently protect that land in a way that you would like to see it protected. Here's some resources. Thank you, Pete, for adding this at the last minute. I'd forgotten it at first. Here's our web address, and of course browsers are so good now you can basically just type in the name, but let me tell you about some other resources. Texas A&M Land Trend Study. There's a world of information there that you'd really enjoy looking at and it's very well displayed in a succinct way that's easily comprehended, and it's very good infographic kind of information. Texas Land Trust Council has an annual meeting, usually in March, I believe. You might want to attend sometime if you're considering a conservation easement, and many people, after they've put a conservation easement in place, want to become part of that group and kind of stay up to speed with what's going on by going to that meeting. So they'll be a good source of information and camaraderie, much like you would have with your own land trust and the other landowners with them. The Land Trust Alliance is a national organization, really good source of information. American Farmland Trust basically was the foundation for a lot of these land trusts, if not all of them, that they're the least bit aggravated, probably have a foundation point at some time with American Farmland Trust to have some kind of, definitely they have a shared vision, but they might have some direct impact from having been formed from them or through people that started with American Farmland Trust. So keep those resources in mind. This is who we are. Sounds like the kind of land trust you'd want to deal with. We'd be glad to help. And contact us anyway. We can help hook you up with the right land trust. If we're not it, we want to make sure you find the outfit that works well for you if you consider doing a conservation easement. And I don't know if there'll be any interest in energy development kind of topics. If there are, I can carry on a little bit longer. Has anyone shown an interest in that in the chat box, Pete?
Oh, yeah, I was trying to unmute myself. I couldn't unmute myself. I haven't seen anything about come across energy. They had a couple of other questions.
Well, let's go ahead if you have some.
Yeah, the couple of questions that came in was from John. He wanted to know what is the definition of landowner.
Definition of landowner is just someone that owns land. It's just simple as that. If you're asking how big a place does it have to be considered a landowner, there's not a minimum. The information they got from the county tax appraisal districts was rural landowners. You know, it wouldn't be land. Technically you could say a city lot would be land. Obviously it is, but that's not what's considered land in the sense of this land trends deal. It's talking about working rural lands, and that information was gathered from the county appraisal districts.
And Mike has a question. He says, how does the conservation easement impact eminent domain condemnation use?
Well, I wish it kept it, I wish it protected you from that, but it doesn't. In fact, it doesn't protect you from mineral exploration either if you don't have the executive rights to the minerals. So it may be, the presence of a conservation easement might, for public relations purposes, encourage an entity to avoid your place, but it may not. There's no reason they'd have to avoid your place just because it has a conservation easement on it.
Okay, Roland asks if you could make the presentation available to him.
Yeah, you're going to have it, right, Pete?
Yeah, I can email it to him. I'll ask him here. Yes, sir.
Well, I'm just saying they'll be able to go to this to your
webinar
archive and find it, right?
Yes, it's recorded and online. And I'll put in the URL for that where it be located. Constant has a question. Says, what is the minimum acreage that can be donated to a land trust?
Well, I mentioned the land transaction costs. We don't have actually we have a minimum not declared yet, but we're thinking about someday coming up with a minimum, just because below that point it usually isn't economically feasible. not because we wouldn't be interested in it. We At some point the transaction costs become expensive enough to where it's not attractive to people. Now I know in some cases even a very small place is still something, regardless of the transaction cost, that someone would want to put in a conservation easement. And there are land trusts that handle real small easements. Land trusts just have to make up their own mind about what uh, size place they want to see protected by them. In our case, we're trying to protect working ag land, so we would tend to be on the larger side than some place that might be really, we're statewide, and some land trusts are more regional, and they might be tickled to get to death to get a small parcel, especially if it's protecting a real important resource like a spring, or I'm just throwing that out as an example, but something like that. There is no minimum size to fit a conservation easement. It really just depends on the land trust that you choose to work with. They might have a minimum that would be best suited for them. In that case, you could choose another land trust, someone else you think you could work with better. The smallest one we have is 60 acres, and it's that small because it's really an educational place. It's like a living farm that people come, that the public is invited to, and it's a really good educational outlet. So there are exceptions, no doubt. So hope
Mike
that
has a
answers it.
question. Mike has a question. How does a conservation easement restrict fragmentation?
Well, the easement typically, I didn't make that very clear, did I? I'm sorry about that. The easement keeps you from being able to break it up into smaller pieces. Now, you may, with the land trust, agree that as you're putting it together, that yes, there'll be one partition or maybe two partitions. That's what we call them, but that's just times that you divide it. And there may be a minimum size for each one of those partitions. That's part of the negotiating that you can do. But the past that, there will be no more breaking it up. So maybe to get the conservation easement in place, the landowner really wants to be able to say, I've got two kids and I'd like to be able to divide it once, but that's all. And in that case, the conservation easement goes with both of them. It hasn't disappeared. It's just become two different conservation easements instead of one. And the land's protected from that point on, and can't be broken up again. So in other
Um,
conservation easements, the agreement is that it'll never be partitioned or never be divided at all. And that's a possibility too.
Melville asks us, can any of these work with oil and gas production on a ranch?
Yes. In fact, let me just go ahead real quickly. Um, you can't keep it from happening, but oil and gas, IRS allows for subsurface extraction as long as there's minimal permanent damage to the surface. You can't have surface mining, and we don't know about wind and solar energy yet. They've been silent on it. But it's here's a place that has made sure all of their production is linear like this. With directional drilling, this is entirely possible, and it's reduced the impact on the place because there's so many. There are fewer roads than there would be in a typical oil field where you got spacing real closely and evenly, kind of on a grid pattern. But all the pipelines follow this. These corridors as well as the pads, and the pads have to be reduced to half an acre in size or so forth, from the original 5 acres, and reseeded, restoration after production. So it can be something that still protects the conservation values. Reseeding successfully done certainly redoes those drilling pads. Even things like to protect the view shed, as we call it, the open space and what it looks like, you can paint tank batteries in a way that makes them blend in. These are all things that have to be in a surface use agreement, and some things that if you get some good legal advice, it might be possible for you with the people that the entities that have the ranch leased for production. Surface mine, much like eminent domain, where companies might avoid your place because it has a conservation easement. I wouldn't hang my hat on that, but it could happen. Sometimes oil and gas companies are concerned enough about the environment, and many of them are now, that they will work with you to minimize the impact so that they you know continue their goals of being environmentally sensitive. Surface mining is prohibited, as you see here, in case that question comes up. So I'll stop with that. Are there any other questions? I just wanted to quickly
Uh,
show y'all some
yes,
pictures.
sir. There's another question says, how much, Norman says, how much money are you talking about with transaction costs? 5K, 10K?
Well, the stewardship fund is usually more than that. Many times the stewardship fund will be 25 or so, and that's just a ballpark figure. We have a way of with our land trust of calculating what it might ought to be, and that includes paying for insurance year to year and so forth. The the total, I'm just throwing out a really big ballpark kind of figure. It can be 75,000 or more, and I'll probably regret throwing that number out there because it can vary so much. But my point is, it can be pretty expensive,
Okay.
and that's why sometimes the smaller places just end up not thinking it's feasible for them. When you think about legal costs and so forth, that can be highly variable depending on your situation, and it can really drive the cost up quite a bit.
Carolyn says, land trust consideration of size may include is a property adjacent to other protected land, including state parks, wildlife management areas for the conservation of habitat. If you have any other questions, y'all feel free to type them in. Uh, Caroline says there's a growing number of financial programs here in Texas that assist landowners with transaction costs. And Patrick asks a question, is there a central place for a list of land trusts? Hello, Ken. I think we lost you. Uh, Ken, can you hear me? I think your audio is. You might want to go up there and check your audio again. Well, Ken, we had a couple of questions. Well, we kind of get Ken's audio going again. Let me say that I'm gonna go ahead and pop out a survey question. Please fill it out. It'll help us in the long run. And everything is all the response anonymous. And we use the survey for impacts of future webinars. And again, our next session is going to be on Thursday, May 2nd. And our topic is going to be range ads for tablet and smartphones. Our speaker is Brian Davis, county agent up in Wilson County, and there'll be one CEU IPM. If you're not doing following us on Facebook, you can follow us on facebook.com/txrange. We normally post twice a week with some educational post, normally on Sunday night and Monday night. Ken? Well, let me go ahead and pop out. Look, we're still having a little problem there. Ken, can you hear us?
Hey, Pete. Looks like we lost Ken, but it looks like Carolyn's answered a lot of the questions there. We sure appreciate that. I know Ken will as well.
Yes. Thank you, Carolyn. And I went ahead and uh, popped out the survey. If you didn't get the survey pop on your screen, click on this link. Again, thank you, Dr. Clayton. I guess I'll. Oop, that was the wrong link. For the link I just popped in on the chat box, y'all were asking if y'all can come and review this webinar is recorded and will be found at naturalresourcewebinars.tamu.edu. And here's actually the link to the survey.